Welcome to the Talking Poem Podcast. I'm your host, Charlie Green. On each episode, I invite a guest to bring in any poem they'd like to talk about for any reason. We'll talk about what excites us, what delights us, maybe what frustrates us. Afterward, we'll have a little bit of silliness and a game. I'm delighted to have as my guest today Dr. Emily Jones. She's the author of Right Romance, Heroic Subjectivity, and Elect Community in 17th Century England, and is an associate professor of English at the University of South Florida. Her areas of specialty include early modern literature, Milton, Shakespeare, and women writers. Emily, thank you so much for being here. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Charlie. I was really delighted to be asked.
Before we get to the poem, because you brought in Sonnet 45 from Sir Philip Sidney's Astrophil and Stella, can you just give us the context of the sonnet sequence as a whole?
So sonnet sequences were really popular in Elizabethan England. They came from Petrarch's Italian sonnet sequence, which was this long collection of sonnets that he wrote about his love for a woman named Laura or Laura. And then they came over to England and people started writing their own sonnet sequences, usually about love, though not always. Philip Sidney was an Elizabethan courtier. He was sort of a golden boy who was good at everything. He was a knight. He could joust. He was a warrior. He actually died in battle. He was like a sportsman. He played tennis. He wrote all kinds of things, literary criticism, romance, poetry. And so he was, even in his own time, people sort of saw him as this like Renaissance man who was so cool and could do everything. And he wrote Astrophil and Stella about a girl, right? Not surprisingly, that he loved named Penelope Devereux. She was Penelope Rich eventually because she got married, unfortunately for him. And Astrophil and Stella means if you play with the Latin and Greek. So Astrophil is star lover, and then Stella is star in Latin. So it's the star lover and the star. And then the Phil in Astrophil is also a little play with Philip Sidney's first name, right? He's Phil. And so part of kind of the gimmick or the game behind Astrophil and Stella is that everybody knew who these poems were about. They knew that they were Philip Sidney's poems about this married woman that he was in love with and about this sort of complicated relationship that they had. But at the same time, there's sort of this veneer of plausible deniability where their names are disguised. And when I teach it, Taylor Swift's name keeps coming up because, she writes these songs about, her various love interests and boyfriends and partners. And people are always saying, oh, this is about this and this is about that. And so Sidney's sequence kind of invites us to do that a little bit where, he refers to specific people and events, but not by name. And so, the people in the know are kind of playing the game with it.
That's great. I've recently turned the corner on Taylor Swift. I was very curmudgeonly about her for a long time. And strangely enough, now that she's dating a famous football player and men are angry about it, I'm like, let them be. It's fine. I don't know why that is the thing that triggered me to be, she's fine. Well, go ahead and read the sonnet, and then I'll ask you for a quick gloss, and then we'll talk.
Sure. So this is number 45. It's from the middle of the sequence. Stella oft sees the very face of woe painted in my beclouded, stormy face, but cannot skill to pity my disgrace, not though thereof the cause herself she know. Yet, hearing late a fable which did show of lovers never known a grievous case, pity thereof gat in her breast such place, that from the sea derived tears spring did flow. Alas, if fancy, drawn by imaged things, though false, yet with free scope more grace doth breed than servants' rack, where new doubts honour brings, then think, my dear, that you in me do read of lovers' ruin some sad tragedy. I am not I, pity the tale of me.
Oh, thank you. I love that last line so much, and I'm sure we'll get into it. Can you give us just a quick paraphrase of the poem, and then we'll head off?
Sure, definitely. So Astrophil, the speaker, is sad, right, because he loves Stella, and she's not giving him grace, right? The whole sequence is about winning Stella's grace, right, her favor, which means a range of different things. Anything ranging from will she like me back to will she go to bed with me? So Stella has been saying no, and when he says Stella oft sees the very face of woe woe painted in my beclouded stormy face, but cannot skill to pity my disgrace, not though thereof the cause herself she know. He's saying, she can see how sad I am, she can see my stormy face, but she doesn't know how to feel pity for me, even though she knows that she's the reason that I'm sad. All right, so she knows all about it, she knows why, but she doesn't take pity on me. Yet, hearing late a fable which did show of lovers never known a grievous case, pity thereof gat in her breast such place, that from the sea-derived tears spring did flow. So recently, though, she was listening to this story about love and lovers that she never met. She was listening to this sad story about love, and she felt so much pity that she started to cry, like copiously. So the fictional story about lovers she never met makes her cry. Alas, if fancy, drawn by imaged things, though false, yet with free scope more grace doth breed than servants' rack, where new doubts honor brings. I'm going to pause there, even though it's not the end of the sentence. If your imagination, right, that moved by imaginary things, even though they're not real, gets more grace, right, more favor out of you than my ruin, right? When he talks about servant's rack, a servant means, your lover who's so devoted to you. If you're more moved by fictional things than by my misery, because, your honor, your concern with your reputation is giving you pause and making you say no to me, then think, my dear, that you and me do read of lover's ruin some sad tragedy. I am not I. Pity the tale of me. So let's pretend that when you look at me, you're reading a fictional story about the ruin of a lover, right? Pretend that I'm a fictional tragedy and not a real person. If you can imagine that I'm not myself, maybe you can feel sorry for the story that you see in me.
That's fantastic. And it gives the poem a kind of double sadness.
Yeah.
That to be pitied, to be, as we may think of it, empathize in the language we use today rather than pity, he has to not be him. And it sort of creates this extra distance.
Yeah.
There's the irony of the extra distance between them. And the thing that stood out to me, and I haven't read Sidney really since when I got my master's degree. I read some of Astrophil and Stella as an undergrad, and then a lot of the sequence in my master's program, but he's very irritated with her. He's kind of insulting. Basically, he seems to be commenting as if he thinks she's kind of dumb. that her inability, like, it's not just beclouded face or stormy face. It's beclouded stormy face. Like, it's so obvious that this is the problem. It's not just a story of lovers, but it's a grievous case that she somehow, there's something either obtuse in her behavior or maybe even sort of like she cannot skill to pity my disgrace.
And I don't think he thinks that she's dumb, but I do think he finds her sort of willfully obtuse, right? She's sort of choosing not to understand or not to regard what's going on with him. And again, he says in where new doubts honor brings. So if you sort of flip the syntax there, honor is bringing doubt to you. So he knows that it's because she's worried about her honor as a woman at court, and what it's going to mean if she does sort of take him as a lover or listen to him or yield to him. So I do think that he's frustrated, right, about how this goes on. I don't really think that he's insulting her intelligence, but I do think that he's vexed, right, with this sort of like will she, won't she courtly game that they're playing. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes more sense. I think the key thing is his frustration.
Yeah.
That he can't get past that frustration. The cannot skill is the thing that kind of, that's the phrase where it's like.
She can't manage to do what should be easy, right? Yeah.
Exactly. So why did you choose this poem?
So I love Sidney. I'm a little bit of a Sidney fangirl, and I love Astrophil and Stella as a sequence. I find Astrophil, the persona that Sidney makes for himself, really interesting and fun. We were just talking about sort of his irritation or frustration, and maybe how it even makes him look a little bit unattractive, right? His sort of annoyance with this girl that he's supposedly so in love with. And I feel like Sidney as a poet, right, writing the sequence, does a lot of work making Astrophil a difficult and complex speaker who sometimes you really enjoy his voice, and sometimes he's whiny and annoying, even as he is also annoyed. And we were talking about sort of the irony and the distancing and the double distancing. Even as he's making Astrophil a persona for himself, he knows that people are going to read Astrophil as him. right? That there's a very fine line between Astrophil the speaker and Philip Sidney the poet. And the reason that I picked this poem is that I think the end of it, right? I am not I, pity the tale of me, is sort of directly commenting on or facing up to this sort of elaborate game that the sonnet sequence is playing, where the poet both is and is not the speaker. Astrophil says to Stella, I'm not Astrophil. And at a remove from that, we're also dealing with the fact that Astrophil is and is not Sidney. And so there's sort of these multiple layers of like imagination and pretense and fictionality that's going on.
I love that, because this seems to be fairly common in some of Shakespeare's sonnets too. There's the word will coming up in certain places. There's I can't remember which one, but there's some scholars read hate away as a reference to Anne Hathaway, his wife, and there's this sort of play about, is this fictional or is this not? And
yes.
For me, Shakespeare's sonnets are the comparison point, because I have read the whole sequence and read a number of them. And this speaker seems different just because the emotional tenor of so many of Shakespeare's sonnets turns to anger, and whereas this turns to kind of like you said, it's kind of whiny.
It's kind of pleading and pathetic, right?
Yeah.
But
the note at the end, I am not I, pity the tale of me, for me at least crosses over that line from whininess into a genuine sadness. Like this has become, there's the play, like you said, on the real Sidney versus Astrophil. I wanted to make the joke, by the way, that Astrophil is not his superhero name. Terrible joke I'm shoehorning in here. But it leads to this real sort of ontological question of I can't even be myself, in this situation, that he can only be a character. So there is the play to it, there is the whininess, and there's also, I think, a kind of surprising emotional depth.
Yeah. And I that really gets to the heart of what I like about the sequence and what I like about the persona, right? He's a very flawed sort of speaker or persona. He can also sometimes be very funny. There's a lot of humor throughout the sonnet sequence. And I think that his conclusion, sort of his solution to the problem, well, just pretend I'm not real, is simultaneously sad and funny, right? Pretend I'm a character. But underneath the sort of silliness and the whininess that Astrophil sometimes shows, I think there is a lot of emotional depth.
Well, that raises a question for me, because it's pretty commonly understood that the sonnets, love sonnets in particular, are always about that beloved who can't be reached. And they really end up always being about the speaker. What do we learn in the sequence about Stella? What is she like to him beyond just the sort of the name of the beloved and in life, Penelope?
Yeah, one of the kind of cool things about the sequence, and I think it's under talked about in the scholarship, is that you actually get to know Stella better in Astrophil and Stella than you get to know a lot of the women, the beloveds, right, in various other people's sonnet sequences. An obvious point of contrast is Petrarch's Laura, right, who's sort of this unattainable goddess, and she's she doesn't really speak. She's so remote all the time. And in Astrophil and Stella, the two of them are always interacting. There's this one interesting sonnet where he writes about hearing her read her poems back to him, and they like come to mean something different for him than they did before. So like they're in dialogue with each other. Things actually change over the course of the sequence, where she's not totally unattainable only and always all the time. Like he sort of gets to like first base with her, where he gets her to kiss him, right? He gets her to agree to accept him as her servant, right? Her love, even though she still won't sleep with him. So they actually sort of do like go through this, some of the steps in this sort of game of courtly love with each other. He writes about, there are a lot of things that he says about Stella, and some of them are very typically sort of traditional, like, she's the paragon of virtue. He both adores her because she's so virtuous and chaste, but that's also part of the frustration, right? She's so good, but then that means that she won't give in to me. He talks about how she's sort of this ideal muse, if any poet wants to learn how to write real love poetry that sounds real and not fake, all they have to do is look at her, right? And they'll be moved to do it. But you also get the impression, I think, as you read through, that he sees her as an intellectual equal, a conversation partner, right? Someone that he takes seriously, even as he also gets frustrated with her. And yeah, there are some times when he like reports things that she says to him, so like she gets a voice sort of in the poems, even though none of them are from her perspective. So yeah, I do think that we get a better sense of her as like an intelligent person who's kind of equal to this game that they're playing.
She has agency in a way other beloveds, it sounds like, doesn't.
Yeah, I think she does. I'm teaching this poem in a graduate course that I'm teaching right now, and we read this article by Melissa Sanchez, who's a great early modern scholar, and she has an interesting piece about Stella and Stella's own desire as it comes through the poem. And she says, everyone who reads this poem wants to make it all about Astrophil's desire and, wants to make Stella the chaste woman who has no desire. And if you actually read closely in the sequence, you see that that's not true. And I don't think we get it in this poem that I read, although we do get her ability, right, to feel passion. But there are other poems that do sort of make clear that she has interest in him, right? And that there's an erotic appeal and a charge to this game that they're playing for her too. And I do think that's unusual.
And that makes sense in terms of just like the structure of this poem, because so many English Renaissance sonnets, they tend to be less narrative within them, and they
right.
The first 8 lines tend to sort of build and reiterate an idea before the turn. And here it's much quicker to the narrative, that the first 4 lines are establishing this is the situation, and then there's the narrative turn very quickly into the poem. And so there's a different kind of storytelling than there seems to be in a lot of Renaissance at least love sonnets.
Yeah, I love sonnets, and I really like seeing the different things that sonneteers do with the turn, right? Where they put it, whether there's sort of like a false turn, right? That you think is the turn, and then it fakes you out because actually there's a bigger one later. Sidney is one of those poets who I think is good at like multiple turns, and I think that you get them in this sonnet. There's the yet, right? Yet, hearing late a fable, which did show, where we, as you say, we kind of dive into the narrative part of the poem. And then there's alas, right, where he sort of takes a step back and says, oh, well, if that's how you feel, how about I propose this? And then I think that the final line, I am not I, pity the tale of me, is sort of an emotional turn, right, in the final couplet, or indeed the last line of the poem. It's not like it changes what they're talking about or changes the idea, but it is punchy, I think, in a way that kind of also makes it qualify as like a final turn. So I think you could arguably count up to 3 in this one.
Absolutely. And even the then think in the those last 3 lines. And yeah. And just to, again, that last line, I just want to read it's not I am not me. I love that we get that I am not I. It is
I am not I.
It's not that he's not himself. He is not, in a way, the subject. And right. So that's I think really, really beautifully done.
Yeah, he's like unmaking himself there.
I have a question that takes us away from the poem a bit, because you mentioned that in the sequence she is sort of writing poems back to him. My Renaissance reading is pretty light, for someone with a PhD.
Yeah, I saw the 20th century. So
yeah, 20th century. So as a side note, for me, throughout my graduate career, and even now a little bit, there's a part of me that still feels like the Renaissance, like that's the real core of the English department. Like that's, Shakespeare is the great. Anyway, I'm not.
I would like to think so.
Yeah, I don't know how much that's true, but it's like this image in my head. Are there female English sonneteers though in the Renaissance?
Oh, dude, yeah, I'm always happy to talk about female sonneteers. The first sonnet sequence in English was written by a woman.
Really? Wow, I had no idea.
Really, really, really. It's not very canonical. Right, we're always sort of in process of reconsidering and revising the canon. But before Shakespeare, before Sidney, and Sidney is before Shakespeare, FYI, shortly before. But before either of them, in I think the year is 1555, though I could be wrong about that. There's a woman named Anne Locke, who is a Protestant living in exile in Geneva, because Mary I is queen in England, and that's Bloody Mary, and she's persecuting Protestants. And she presents it as a translation of a psalm, but every line of the psalm becomes a sonnet. And so it's sort of like this extended meditation on part of scripture. And it's this like sonnet sequences, even though it's not about love, it's very personal, it's very psychological, sort of about the speaker's like torment and feelings of guilt and relationship to God and to salvation. And so yeah, she has this sequence of sonnets that are based on the psalm. And so yeah, the first sonnet sequence in the language is actually hers.
Well, that's so fascinating to me. One, because it's about a very different kind of love. It's not this sort of romantic tradition. Whereas I think the sonnet was, as has been established in scholarly terms, it's a love poem. And granted, the sonnet has changed a great deal over the centuries. Have you read any Diane Seuss? She's a contemporary poet.
Unfortunately, no, I haven't.
I think you would find her really interesting. Her most recent book is called Frank, and it's sonnets, but they're not at all traditional sonnets. Like most of them don't rhyme. Many of them are not 14 lines. There was a contemporary poet named Paisley Rectal who was like, well, how are these sonnets? And it's basically, it all has to do with the volta, like the way that the poems turn.
Yeah.
But it's fascinating to me that the way that the sonnet actually enters English is not through this kind of romantic love poem, that it really appears.
Right.
So are writers like Sidney and Shakespeare familiar? Like, how widespread is Anne Locke?
I don't know how familiar they necessarily would have been with her. Sidney, actually, maybe, because Sidney and his family were very devout Protestants, and Sidney was well educated and very well read. So it's not crazy, right, to think that he could have been familiar with her writing. Yeah, he and his family were sort of members of this like extended European Protestant circle. So it is possible. For clarity, there were other writers writing sonnets in English earlier than Anne Locke, but she's the first sequence writer. All right. Sorry, I'm trying to think of the rest of your question. Oh, right. Whether she would have been influential. Yeah, it's hard to know how much, right? I think especially with women writers, because they're less likely both now and then sort of to be directly cited, even when they are influences. But you were talking about, these sonnets that don't have all the features of sonnets, like they're not necessarily 14 lines, but they have a turn. In the early modern period, in the Renaissance, the sonnet wasn't always like strictly codified. So you get a lot of poems like that are sonnet-ish, right? They're short and they have a volta, but they may not be 14 lines. And women all over the place were writing short lyrics with turns in them. Queen Elizabeth wrote them. Another person who wrote a long sonnet sequence was Sidney's niece, who kind of idolized him. Her name was Mary Wroth. She also had a wild and cool life where she carried on this extended affair with her first cousin and had 2 of his children. And her sonnet sequence is all about like that tempestuous relationship, again, kind of under cover of other names. But she's very consciously sort of imitating her uncle, Philip Sidney, but putting her own like woman spin on the sonnet sequence. So yeah, women were great sonneteers in the early modern period, but both of kind of traditional sonnets and like variations on them.
Oh, that's fantastic. Are love sonnets by women in the Renaissance, do they follow this sort of template of unrequited love and, that we see in Shakespeare? Or you mentioned Mary Wroth, that her sonnets are much more about the narrative of a troubled marriage, which seems like a very different kind of narrative.
It is a different kind of narrative because it's not like, in a sense, it is about unrequited love, but unrequited in a different way, right? Because in the case of most love sonnets by men, the idea is that, you can't get your beloved to favor you, right, to go to bed with you. In Mary Wroth's case, right, she's writing about a man that she was having a long-term affair with. Okay. So the sort of sexual component is already in place, and the unrequitedness comes from the fact that he's not really faithful to her, right? First of all, he's married to someone else, right, while he's with her. And then if you assume that the person she's writing about is the historical man, he wasn't faithful to either of them, right? He was kind of a dog who was hanging around with many women. And so her unrequited passion is about her constancy of devotion in response to him, being sort of ambivalent towards her. So again, it does take on kind of a different flavor.
That's fantastic. Well, I'm going to put links to every poet you mentioned in the show notes. So if people want to head out to read Mary Wroth and Anne Locke, who sound also like their biographies are fantastically wild. So is there anything else you want to mention about this poem before we transition into the silliness and game?
No, I don't think so. Nothing. I think we covered most of the stuff that I was hoping we'd talk about. So
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for bringing this in. I hadn't read Sidney in a long time, and I don't think I really was that interested in him when I was in grad school. But I think, I was young. I was young and wrong about most things. Now I'm older and wrong about most things. Before we get to the game, we have not one ad, but two, and by happenstance, Emily, they relate to your field of study. So, first, terrific. CBS has an exciting new sitcom sure to appeal to modern lovers. There aren't just couples, there are thruples. And what happens when the trio is the dog from the Jetsons, the uncle from the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, and Miss Dubois from A Streetcar Named Desire? This fall on CBS, watch Astro, Phil, and Stella.
I didn't see that coming. I should have.
I was so tickled when I came up with this one.
That's great.
The second one is a little bit longer, so if you're listening and you need to fold some laundry, this might be a good time if you're not a fan of puns. William Shakespeare wrote, "If music be the food of love, play on. Well, if food be the food of life, then eat up." Darden, the parent company of Olive Garden, Ruth's Chris Steakhouse, and other fine eateries, is bringing something new to its family of restaurants designed to bring high culture to the United States. A franchise of Shakespeare-themed restaurants. You're guaranteed to love the cuisine, all designed by renowned French chef Guy Fieri, best known for his Ville des Saveurs. Just listen to these options. Do you like a buffet meal with all the fixins? Try Henry VIII. How about classic British food? All's Wellington that ends Wellington. At Burger King, you can have it your way, but at Rosalind's Grill, everything is as you like it. You can try all the world's cuisines. Do you love Asian food? Grab your chopsticks and head down to Ramen and Julienne. Do you like bruschetta? Everybody likes bruschetta, so head on to Broilus and Water Cressida. We have a...
This is getting very strained.
Yes. Oh, yeah, absolutely. No,
unlike the quality of mercy, which is not strained.
These are not all natural puns. We have a great Spanish place, Comida de Arroz, and a great Chinese place, the Comedy of Egg Rolls. Try that's my wife's one, by the way. Thank you, Charlotte. Try Italian-Egyptian fusion at Anchovy and Cleopasta. Or maybe you don't want international cuisine. We have places devoted to soup, like A Midsummer Night's Dream. Or if you need a place for dudes who like soup and just want to go be dudes who like soup, how about Brothello, the broth-based brothel?
That's great.
You're probably a fan. These keep going. This is very, very thorough. You probably enjoy meat. Do you like roast beef? Well, get ready for much au jus about nothing, where, of course, you can get a hero. I was expecting a big laugh for much au jus about nothing.
Much au jus about nothing. But, sorry, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
I was still distracted by the bro brothel.
Do you love seafood? Visit Love's Labor's Lobster, where they have an excellent king crab leer. Do you like deer meat? Head to the Merchant of Venison. If you like pork, you can try Cymbeloin or Hamlet. And if you like beef, get your knives ready for Coriolangus. Do you enjoy your chicken really, really fresh? Then head on down to the slaughterhouse/restaurant, The Moan of Fat Hens. For non-Shakespeareans, The Moan of Fat Hens is Timon of Athens. For the vegetarians and vegans among us, try The Taming of the Shroom or the Tempes. Or maybe you want a salad. You can visit our organic food stand and ask for ripped chard with 3 sides. Ripped chard with 3. That's my wife again. Yep. The good ones are mine, and we recommend that you get as a side the Macbeth and cheese, but don't worry, if you spill it on yourself, it will be easy to get out that damned spot. When it's time for dessert, just try 12th Bite, where they have an excellent poached Pericles and Midsummer Night's Dreamsicle. And they also have a tasty one that you want to ask about the ingredients first. It is Titus Androna custard. Maybe you just want to drink. We have a brewery, Brew Gentleman of Corona, and a winery, A Vintner's Tale. We're almost done here. If you'd like to take some bread home, visit our artisanal bakery, Measure for Measure, where you can pick up a King Johnny cake. And if you need cutlery, try the Merry Knives of Winster or Henry Fork. If you're wondering why I haven't mentioned Julius Caesar, it turns out that there are no food puns related to Julius Caesar. So, satisfy...
Not a single one.
Not one. Not one at all. Not one at all. Orange, you glad. So satisfy your hunger. At one of our Shakespeare-themed restaurants, we can feed any sweet tooth, savory tooth, or Richard tooth. Thank you for indulging me. On to...
You got almost all of them. How many plays did you get in there?
I got all of them except a couple of the history plays.
I was thinking histories, maybe not all of them, but I think everything else was in there.
I left out, I got all the comedies and tragedies, and I think at a certain point it was Henry IV part
Too many
1.
Henrys.
Yeah, too many Henrys. That seems like should be the title of something. Too many Henrys.
Yeah.
On to a game that I'm calling Billy, don't you lose my number. In this game, she looks appropriately horrified. In this game, I'll give you the first line of one of Shakespeare's sonnets, and I want you to tell me the number. If you can, if you can recite, we'll see. If you can recite the entire poem, you get bonus points.
Oh. Okay.
So if I were to say, for example, shall I compare thee to a summer's day, you would say sonnet 18. So
18.
Yes.
Okay.
So,
but man, you could have given me that one and I could have looked cool for like 1 second.
Well, I thought about it. I was like, I could have gotten that in junior high. Like that's, if anybody knows a Shakespeare sonnet, they know 18. Shall I compare thee?
I'm going to embarrass myself because while I'm okay with Shakespeare sonnets, I am extremely bad with numbers and with associating numbers with poems. And I've actually, every time I teach them, I'm like, I apologize to my students because I can never remember the associated number. So, go.
We'll see here. Dr. Emily Jones, are you ready to play Billy, don't you lose my number?
As ready as I will ever be, yes.
Number 1, let me not to the marriage of true minds.
Admit impediments. Love is not love, which alters when it alteration finds or moves with the remover to remove. It's very lovely, and I don't know. 80-something?
116.
116? Okay.
Yeah. This is the point. If listeners haven't read the sonnets, they are not really in any particular order. Like,
no.
Scholars have said, oh, well, these last are the Dark Lady sonnets, and you can see some patterns, but not really. It's like Ariel by Sylvia Plath, where she didn't actually get to edit it before she died, or she had a sequence, but Ted Hughes ruined it.
I also want everyone to know that I have an anthology sitting next to me from which I read Sidney, so I could cheat right now, and I'm not cheating.
Good. You're just throwing us off the scent by getting the first one wrong. Number 2, when to the sessions of sweet silent thought?
47.
30.
This
is... Those, by the way, are the only 2 I would have gotten right out of the 5 I chose.
All right. Well, you're better than I.
Well, and this is a little bit of a callback because on our previous episode, the person I was talking to, we could not remember the title of Remembrance of Things Past. We were sitting there, we know it's Proust, and it was a fiction writer, and we were lost. Number 3, I think the puns actually lower everybody's collective IQ. And so any memory you have of numbers. Number 3, and you're welcome, by the way, to recite if you have any of these memorized.
Okay, yeah. Usually I have like pieces rather than full sonnets, but I'll see what I can do.
Yeah, I'm a terrible memorizer of poems. So number 3, the expense of spirit and a waste of shame.
Expense of spirit and a waste of shame is lust and action until action, lust is something. Yeah, it's good. It's late because it's a Dark Lady sonnet, and it might be 120.
Very close, 129.
129. Okay.
But I'm giving you the bonus points for
all right.
Reciting enough of 1 and 3. Number 4, when I have seen by time's fell hand defaced.
And that's not even one that I know very well. Let's make up a number. 92.
Well, 92 is a real number. You did not make that up.
Yeah, I didn't make up the number. You're right.
It's 64. The last 64. 2, I was like, the last 2, I was like, oh yeah, I guess those are sonnets. They did not ring a bell with me at all. And the last one, being your slave, what should I do but tend?
117.
57.
57?
So you got one digit correct. But, well, I mean, this is the thing. You're either a person who teaches the sonnets and knows all the numbers exactly, or
and
you teach the sonnets and
I
don't
am not
care.
such a person. I'll out myself a little bit and perhaps treat this as an apology for my abject failure at that game. I love Shakespeare's plays, and I also love Renaissance poetry. And I have gone on record to say that I think Shakespeare is a much better dramatist than he is a sonnet writer. I find his sonnets just okay for the most part compared to others of his contemporaries. And so while I do teach the sonnets, and while I think there are some great things about them, they're not my favorites. And
Yeah.
I have not spent as much time with them as I have with some other things.
Yeah.
And so yes, I'm extraordinarily bad at knowing the numbers of them. There are maybe half a dozen sonnets that you could have named that I could have given you numbers for, and maybe not even that.
The analogy I'm going to invent here for the sonnet, for Shakespeare sonnets, is that it's like the Rolling Stones catalog. The great songs are incredible, but if you listen to the albums, there's just a lot of hit and miss. That's the analogy I'm going with. We're both going to be canceled.
Yeah, there's just so many of them, right? He wrote so many; they can't all be bangers.
And it's not narrative at all. Like there's no
right,
except for the Dark Lady. There's no way to really put them in a particular place.
Yeah. I'm somewhat persuaded by the argument, and this helps with the whole who was the Dark Lady, who was the fair youth kind of thing. I'm somewhat persuaded by the idea that Shakespeare's sonnets were written over a long period of time, and that he was kind of experimenting with different narrative voices in different situations, such that you can almost associate some of the sonnets with certain characters from the plays at given moments. It's like, oh, this sounds like Othello at this moment, or oh, this sounds like Antonio from The Merchant of Venice. So like again, kind of treating the sonnet as like little mini dramatic monologues. I like that idea.
All right, then. That makes a certain amount of sense. Although there are a number of the sonnets that I just love as individual sonnets. Thank you, Emily, so much for being here. Is there anything you want to say or plug before we go?
I want to give a shout out to Carolyn Oliver, my pal from grad school, who suggested that I might enjoy coming on the podcast, which I did very much.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Even though I was embarrassed as I'm sort of exposed as a pseudo Shakespearean. But
how would you have done if I had pulled in Sidney or Spencer?
I'm just not a number person. My numbers are bad. So if you had asked me to complete lines, I probably would have done better for you.
See, this is the thing I've been saying from the beginning about the games, is that there's no quality control in terms of like how easy or difficult they are. So people generally get all or nothing. But anyway, thanks for listening. And no shame, by the way. No shame on doing poorly in these games.
I don't feel real shame.
Good.
An expensive spirit and a waste of shame.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for listening. Have a great day. Go read some poems, pet some dogs, and support striking workers wherever you find them. In the show notes, you will find the labor action tracker from Cornell School of International Labor Relations. Many thanks to them for maintaining the site. Bye.